In past years, I've been asked to scribble down a few takeaways that I think are useful. Selfishly, things that I'm thinking about, and then now it's sort of things that I think we all should think about. And so I figured I would go through in 5 minutes about 12 takeaways that I think at least struck me, and maybe some of you will agree. But the first one, when Jim opened and he was talking about how he met Mark Benioff in the halls of Oracle, and he was a peer, reinforced something I've heard from a lot of people who have started great businesses, which is that their most valuable network were always their peers. And it's interesting because when, later on in your career, when you go and you speak at conferences and everyone wants to meet the speakers, the truth is that, of course, it's the people around you right now, probably more so than people on stage. They're going to be like absolutely crucial points of your career and network. And so I just thought that was really striking and was consistent with what I've heard, from many others. The second piece that I thought was really relevant was just how he talked about the COA Club and this, group of people that have stuck together long enough. And I actually, having invested in many startups now over the years, some of the best companies actually did have 3 to 5 years of kind of going sideways. Sometimes they call them the lost years. But what's always striking is just how some teams find a way to stick together long enough to figure it out. Whereas most don't, because we're always compelled by headlines and the sense that other people are making progress faster than we are. And especially in this day and age, I feel like we're always just hopping around. I don't know. I mean, life expectancy 150 years ago is like 26 years old. So maybe it's just not even biologically hardwired to stick together long enough, 5+ years to figure something remarkable out. But I think if we find ways with our culture to keep our teams together, maybe that's sort of how we hack the system, so to speak. Third one is I was struck by a point that Jim and a couple others made around being willing to change in an organization, being able to move projects around, move people around. And Jim was also talking about how he sort of built a lot of things, but then they were planted elsewhere. And it made me think of this concept of repotting, how you kind of repot something so its roots grow bigger and stronger. And maybe that's part of being an entrepreneur within a bigger team, is actually, as opposed to fiefdom building and doing the things people typically do in big companies, always trying to move things around to optimize for where they're more likely to grow, take root, and build something fantastic. I thought there were some great thoughts today about actually looking for the right problem to solve. And Susie talked about, flour, sugar, butter. She was just like, hey, it got so crazy. And I decided to just bring it all back to the basics. And that's actually very consistent with something I feel some of the best technology products also do, which is they in some ways bring us back to the way things once were, but with more scale and efficiency. And I think it's actually always a hint when you're building a great product to think about the ancestral kind of tendencies that we have, the things that we may long for, and also just bring things back to basic. A lot of great, even enterprise SaaS companies start and succeed because they're simpler versions of more complex products. And then what happens is what I call the Silicon Valley life cycle, or the Silicon Alley life cycle, where people flock to a simple product because it's easy to manage and understand. And then that product takes its users for granted, adds new features for monetization, only listens to its power users. It becomes super complicated and big. And then what happens? People flock to a simple product again. And that VCs love that. But I think as entrepreneurs, we should try to defy that. I think another sort of insight was around just trying to find something that is currently inconvenient. And so I remember when Barry was talking about Blue Mercury, and he was just saying everyone bought 90% of all cosmetic sales were in malls. And he was like, that's not convenient for most of America, and let's do something to change that. And I love that idea of just finding just optimizing a 10x function, a change in convenience on something that currently is a major, part of our lives is clearly an area where we should all be playing and thinking about. A lot of comments from folks, Susie at first, and then others who talked about the things that they're not willing to compromise or scale. And she was talking about, for example, I don't want to do franchises, and I'm not going to use crappy butter. I'm going to fend off the private equity folks that are penny pinching me because I want to make sure that the art of what I've built is always there and intact, even if that sort of slows down growth in some way. And I'm reminded of that kind of concept that the science of business is scaling. All we're told about in business school and everywhere else is just how to make things more efficient and better. And yet perhaps it's that art of business, that the things that don't scale that truly distinguish a brand and make it different than, say, every other bakery on the planet. I thought that was really striking as well. There was a great quote that Barry shared about, talent is, I maybe got this wrong, but talent is hitting a target nobody can hit. Genius is hitting a target nobody can see. And this is something that we, all of us need to be orientated a little bit towards disruption and seeing things differently. The question is how? Like, how do we do this? And the thing that I think often about that I'd share if it's useful is it's always a question of the edges that may someday become the center. And if you ask a group of people whether they agree that some edge is going to be relevant, the answer will always be no, because it's non-consensus by default. It's an edge still. And so the question is, can you get particular people to really become fascinated and curious about a particular edge? And can then, through your respect for them, can that become socialized with a group to the point where people sort of start to see the future a little bit? And they're like, oh, that edge actually, I could see how that could happen. And it's those investments, either as investors or entrepreneurs, and if we're lucky in big companies, those edges that become the center end up making all the difference. The next one is about, let's see, it's about empathy and understanding the customer. And this was something that a number of folks discussed today. And I have some notes here, but solving problems, right? So Heather talked about asking the customer, what they need, and oftentimes getting the wrong response. I held one focus group in my business, Behance, and we got a bunch of people together and said, do you need a creative network? And we were universally told, hell no. We've got MySpace, we've got Facebook, we've got LinkedIn, we've got DeviantArt. The last thing we need is another place to put our work online. I was like, oh, great. Well, then what are you suffering from? Oh, I never get attribution for my work. No one ever discovers my portfolio. It's always out of date. There were a litany of sort of problems or things they were suffering from. And that's kind of when I realized that focus groups are testing for familiarity, right? But if you're really trying to understand and build something new for a customer, you have to ask them really about what they're struggling with. And there were a number of folks that made the point today about empathy in some way, shape, or form. And actually, I think it's a tricky part for most of us, because a lot of us as entrepreneurs are passionate about a solution in our mind's eye, and then we're liable to go off and work towards our passion for years, and then realize that we're 30 degrees off of product market fit, something isn't right. So I always say that empathy is a far more powerful thing to have than even passion. A number of points about getting a full stack education was a term that was used, and Reggie at P&G, for example, spoke about how important it was that to develop the appreciation for the messy and actual frictions of his customers, being in different parts of a business, conducting focus groups, understanding, for example, the story about, people that are baking and the fact that they just hate the mess and they hate the cleanup, and how that informs brand decisions and product decisions. And a number of other folks talked about just the importance of rotating around. And so when I advise people early in their careers, I'm oftentimes advising them to take roles that will expose them to the most functions possible, because it's like that, it's those dots being connected that I think oftentimes becomes an advantage in one's career. So now let's talk about AI. And Jennifer just did a great job, I think, of talking about, first of all, showing some facts about how fast this is all coming, how relevant this is to all of us, the C's that are this crucial playbook that we need to be considering in terms of how this actually affects us. And I'm in the creative industry, and a lot of creatives are worried about the impact of AI. And my answer is, you should be if you don't use it. I think that AI is going to do two things, right? It's going to lower the floor, meaning far more people are going to be able to do things that you didn't ordinarily have the power to do before. For some of us, that's drawing and painting or design. For others, it's being able to run a back office as a small business, or having accounting capabilities, or doing contracts. So it lowers the floor in many industries, but it also raises the ceiling, right? What was possible before was always limited by time, frankly. Even a creative professional in my business, their solutions are only as good as the surface area that they can possibly discover in the time that they're given. And so with AI, if they can actually have 100x more cycles of discovery and find new and cool solutions, they'll find better solutions for their client and their customer. And so in some ways, I think we should recognize, first of all, we have to embrace this. or else we'll be out hustled by it. And at the same time, it's not just about empowering more people, it's also empowering more potential per person, more ingenuity per person. Listening to your inner voice. This was something that that really struck me, and a number of folks up here talked about the importance of, turning up the volume of your own intuition. And I think it's important as everyone sort of tells you what they think, as you go into these focus groups that are really tests for familiarity and consensus checks, you will have to learn to, really tune into your own intuition and amp up the volume, even though in some ways we're trained to not to. I mean, a lot of traditional education sort of teaches us to read and memorize and learn from others. And here's where, in this entrepreneurial journey, it is up to us. I think that earlier in our career, it's important that we seek a role where we can see our impact. This was a very interesting point that both Heather and Reggie made about, Reggie talked about being motivated by pace and learning by making a change, like by actually making a change. That's how learnings were really indoctrinated. Heather about lighting up, she really lit up on the impact she made on eBay and as opposed to Microsoft, where she couldn't ever tell whether she moved the needle of a product. And I think this is a great insight as well, because these are the stories you share with your team that motivate them and have them respect you. And of course, these are also the playbooks you develop that you end up using in your own career. Last few, creating a culture and an environment where the best people can be the best they can possibly be. Heather talked about psychological safety. We just went through an exercise that helped us have a better understanding of our own tendencies and therefore how we work with others. This notion of being genuine, but also being direct, is important. We talk about psychological safety, which is critical, but that also means people have to not only be comfortable and be respectful to make it feel safe, but they still have to be direct. And I think that the best cultures have that balance of psychological safety while also never making people feel like they can't have a very strong and bold assertion that others don't agree with. Getting into the game, don't be afraid to break norms. It's a marathon, not a sprint. This was a quote from Barry, our entrepreneur of the year, and I thought it was a good sort of game face. And then finally, it was said once, but I think a few people alluded to this notion that they had to feel comfortable being doubted. And this really struck a chord for me, because I do think that, a lot of us are very sensitive to critics and what other people think, and certainly I am. And I think that at times when you have so much conviction in something, you can actually learn to gain confidence from doubt. When people don't get it, but you really have done the work, then suddenly you realize that you've seen an edge that will become the center that others actually haven't seen. And you have to make sure that you don't dull that edge out, but in fact, learn to gain confidence from doubt, knowing that nothing extraordinary is ever achieved through ordinary means. And I think as entrepreneurs, we have to remember that, as well as never give your cake away. Thank you. All right.